Happy weekend! We hope it's a good one. We're here doing a little business casual chatting. Billy Business.
I only know how to do it casual.
Every day, every way.
Every way.
I'm Roth Cornet. We're going to talk about something we never talk about around here, which is Disney and Lucasfilm.
Never once.
Never once have we discussed this. But in this case, we spoke with Richard Rushfield, who has a newsletter called The Ankler. He is a Hollywood insider. He sort of gets the scoop about what's going on inside the studios. We did a previous piece about the situation at Warner Brothers, and here's a little bit about what's going on at Disney, specifically with Lucasfilm. And let's just start with the most obvious question. In terms of levels of world domination, just how much power does the mouse actually have?
They are pretty much the one great success story of the last few years. They've built not only they built the Disney brand up into great things, but they've built two other brands with Marvel and Lucasfilms into these huge empires. Any one of those three brands would save another studio at the moment, and they have three of them going, and not to mention Pixar and the animation division. So they are by far vastly, their dominance over the film world just can't be overstated right now.
Well, we've got The Incredibles 2 coming out this very weekend as you're watching this, so I think that we'll see them be dominant once again at the box office. And to Richard's point, it can't be overstated. Here's a twist, however.
Right.
This week, AT&T was able to go through with their purchase of Time Warner, which means that Comcast is now going to counter Disney's offer for Fox, which could ultimately sort of not level the playing field at all. Disney is way dominant, no doubt about it, but make it a little less top heavy than it would be if Disney's able to purchase Fox.
Yeah, I think we've all been kind of waiting to see how this case, with the DOJ was going to pan out. I still think even without Fox, Disney is still a powerhouse, even just with Lucasfilm and Marvel, and then you throw in Pixar, you're still talking about a huge chunk of the market share. That's without any X-Men or any Fox properties that maybe come along. So I do agree that adding those into Disney just would make it beyond comprehension unstoppable, but I don't think it diminishes their dominance by if Comcast is able to come in with a cash bid. That being said, I do think there would be some penalties if they pulled out of the Fox deal, so Disney'd still get something out of it.
Disney's always getting something out of everything, but I mean, it is true. Like, they have such a dominant piece of the box office at the moment. They have the number 1 and number 2 film of the year so far in Avengers, Infinity War, and Black Panther. Here comes Incredibles 2. That's also going to make a lot of money, especially over time because it's opening up sort of staggered internationally. The big question is going to be going forward, how dominant can they be on streaming? Because as we've talked about quite a little bit, that's not just where it's going, it's where it is.
Right.
And they are launching their streaming service in 2019, which, as we talked about, is largely why they wanted to buy Fox. So how does Richard feel about Disney v. Netflix?
They are entering into a sort of the critical death match, a sort of entertainment semifinals showdown versus Netflix, with the thought that the viewers of the future will be much less at movie theaters and be much more at watching it at home or on their phones or iPads or what have you, and that is going to be coming not via the traditional cable companies, but via streaming services. And within the world of streaming services, Netflix is overwhelmingly dominant right now, has been spending vast sums of money that traditional studios can't even dream of. They're spending more on production this year than any other studio in history has ever approached. And Disney is working on building what they call their OTT service, their streaming service. But by the time it comes out, Netflix is going to have such a dominant position, is going to be closing in on 100 million U.S. users, that Disney is really going to be coming into that fight as the underdog when they finally launch.
He makes a lot of interesting points. However, I can't help but think that I don't know. I do think that Disney can compete against Netflix ultimately because their brand has so much power. It's not
Right.
like Warner Brothers launching a streaming service. Disney as a brand has parks already. It has merchandising. Children and families have grown up with it. It is an embedded brand. If anything can compete, it's Disney.
Yeah, I saw some stat recently that Netflix is worth like almost 5 times what Disney is. Like, Netflix has a ton of value. That being said, if anyone's going to slay the giant, it's going to be Disney. And the reason why, and it's the reason why Disney's so dominant, is we have come to this place in entertainment where everything is about IPs, intellectual properties. Well, guess who has the best toys in the toy box?
Disney.
It's Disney.
But Disney itself is that. Not only do they have Marvel and Lucasfilm and Pixar, not only do they have the Disney princess movies, I mean, they are the biggest, one of the most recognizable pieces of IP brands in the world.
Yeah, I think the thing about Disney too is they really have an angle that Netflix can't hit, which is if I go on Netflix, sure, I could find Arthur the Magic School Bus to put on for my kid, but they may take the remote, wander around, find Orange is the New Black. It's so eclectic that you don't really, there's no safety net. No, I know they have like kids versions and everything, but it's not a service designed to meet one particular audience. It's a service designed to meet every audience. Whereas Disney is saying like, this is a family-friendly service. Anything that we have on here, you can feel comfortable, putting on and watching with your kids and your family. And I think that's a huge part of what Disney's appeal is in general.
Yeah, you cannot undercut that at all. I've talked to a bunch of friends with kids, and they've sort of talked about the freedom and the ability to just sort of trust that, and that's the thing, that's what Disney has built up, is trust. And they've said, certainly they have content that isn't as kid-friendly. They've got the Marvel Netflix series. There's certain shows on ABC that probably wouldn't be as family-friendly. However, where all of those go and where they land, hard to say, particularly if the Fox deal does go through for Disney. They own a lion's share of Hulu at that point. They are putting some of the things on Netflix, though, I think they'll, in terms of the Netflix Marvel series. So how things shake out in that realm, it's unclear. But whether Disney takes out Netflix is not even the point.
No.
Can it sustain as its own streaming service is really the point. And none of these companies can compete once, and we've talked about this before, whole other topic, once the real Silicon Valley companies get involved, like your Apples, because they have endless amounts of money to spend.
Well, one thing Disney also has going in its favor for the streaming service is that Disney, and they've done this historically, they are no fools when it comes to market research and letting other people make the mistakes and do all the hard work before they jump into something. Perfect example was they waited out the HD DVD versus Blu-ray war to see what was going to win, and then once everyone had come out with theirs and decided it was Blu-ray, then they jumped into it, and not only did they jump in, they did it better than anyone else. And I have no doubt that with the amount of content that they have versus the resources and the structures that they have to make something great, the Disney streaming service isn't going to come on and just be a piece of crap. Like, I've always said for years, they put their movies away in the Disney vault so you can't buy them for a couple years, and they build this demand. I believe the streaming service is going to be the vault, and this is your chance to have Pinocchio whenever you want, forever, as long as you pay for the service. It's never going away.
And there's a level of Disney loyalty and fandom that is very, very powerful, and people will tune in and they will purchase and they will sign up just for the vault and access to the vault if they really are going to do that.
Right.
It would be a very smart move. How their strategy evolves, like one of the reasons, and we've said this even here, that they were purchasing Fox was to have more, to have a larger catalog for the streaming service. So if that doesn't go through, I am curious to see how their approach will change. But here's the other thing, and Disney, as you said, will watch other people and watch where the tide is going. It is going to streaming, but that's not their only revenue stream. In fact, movies, how big a part movies are versus merchandising versus the park is a question that we had that we talked to Richard about. When you think about Disney, though, in terms of box office sales in general, right? They have, how does that sit in relative terms to their other, in terms of their business? Is it more about the merchandising? Is it their parks? Is it all of a piece?
If you look at Disney's, there was a lawsuit a few years ago where it came out. The Winnie the Pooh, A.A. Milne estate was suing for more money. It came out that Disney was making something like $1 billion a year in licensing Winnie the Pooh and putting Winnie the Pooh on diapers and napkins and things like that. So these movies are almost just advertisements for a whole product line. Whether the movie goes up, whether the audience goes up 10% or down 10%, doesn't even really matter. It's just that they sell so many products. They sell the amount of money a family spends in a day at Disneyland when they come to see that, and then they have the Star Wars land that's going to open at Disneyland is immense compared to the piece of the movie ticket that Disney gets back from it. So these are all just giant, humongous, multi-billion-dollar product lines, and the movies function almost as just an advertisement for these things.
The idea of a Marvel movie functioning as a piece of advertising for the toys is we've talked about this before. It's a little bit cynical, right?
It's a cynical way of looking at things.
It's a little cynical way of looking at things, because the truth is that Disney is so dominant right now at the box office because they're putting out good films. For the most part, they're putting out good films, solid films that people like and they want to go see, often on repeat. However, there's certainly a precedent for a film franchise really functioning as advertisements for the toys and also making a lot of money. That's Transformers. So the idea that they want to make good films that also bolster other revenue streams at Disney, of course they do.
Yeah, I mean, look, this concept of the movie, especially with IPs being a commercial for the toys, go back and listen to Joel Schumacher's DVD commentary for Batman and Robin, where he literally comes in and it's like, the toy company said, how do we make your movie more toyetic, was the word. So yeah, it's a cynical way of looking at it from a certain perspective, but to act like it doesn't happen is completely untrue. That being said, I do think that Disney does try at least very hard, whether it works or not, to make movies that satisfy on an artistic level, but are also very commercially, they're able to get people to go buy the merchandise, essentially. Sometimes that doesn't work, like with Solo. I do wonder, Solo didn't turn out quite the way that they were hoping, the way, a lot of fans were hoping, and I think they were counting on a lot of fans to go see that movie and then want to go buy the new version of the Millennium Falcon,
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a conundrum, right? Because if Solo was meant to function that way, and I had talked to a woman that runs a Star Wars fan site, and she said the largest box of toys that she's received of any of the films so far was for Solo.
Yeah.
And they were pushing hard to buy those Han, for kids to buy those Han figures and Chewie, and you're right. So whether that was effective or not is still TBD, right?
Right.
But here's the other thing is, that is only X percent, and we'll get into Kathleen Kennedy and her role at Lucasfilm a little bit here in a minute. There's only X percent of the whole picture of what Star Wars means to Disney. They've got Star Wars Land coming out. They have more than made their money back for the purchase from George Lucas. So this is an absolute gift that could keep on giving, and they want to keep on giving. And we'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. But one of the challenges in terms of Star Wars, and we'll talk about how Solo relates to this, is China, right? This is one of the largest markets in the world, and they just don't respond or have the attachment to Star Wars that we do here. So how is Lucasfilm going to handle that? We talked to Richard about it.
The Star Wars series has, especially with this trilogy, it's got a built-in problem that China and much of the world didn't have movie theaters when the original Star Wars came out. So there's just no way that the world's going to have this nostalgia for Luke and Han like Americans do, and you can't build that in. And this trilogy has relied. I mean, if you didn't grow up with Luke Skywalker, I don't know what The Force Awakens meant to you and how that movie has any relevance. So they've just got this built-in problem. When you look at how they're talking about they're going to be creating new universes and the new Rian Johnson thing they're doing, and all this, it seems like they're trying to have a clean slate here, where they can say to the world, you can get in on the ground floor of this. You don't need that history with the franchise.
You have a really interesting theory about why they went ahead with Solo when so many of the fans here were crying out, "No thanks! Harrison Ford's my Solo. What are you doing? I don't want this movie." But how it may work for a broader plan.
Yeah, I could totally see the strategy, 5 years ago or so being, look, Star Wars is not this nostalgic, beloved thing in China. What if some of these prequel movies, like a Solo, that's almost like a base point for everybody. If if you show someone Han Solo in the middle of a story, or you come out with episode 7 and you're like, this is the guy at the end of his road, I don't really know, I don't care. But if we start everybody on the even playing field of like, this is the character of Solo, this is, who he started as, this is why everyone's going to love him. And then you get that audience invested from the beginning of that character. For us, it's not the beginning, but it could be for them. It could potentially be like, oh, you liked Han Solo in his Solo movie. Well, guess what? He's in episode 4, 5, 6, 7. He's going to be in this cartoon or in Star Wars, Tokyo, wherever. To get people who are not us, who are not lifelong Star Wars fans, invested in these characters that already exist within other properties. The problem is it just didn't work.
It just didn't work, and there's so many different reasons for that, and we've unpacked quite a bit in terms of Solo previously, but just hitting on the major challenges around prequels for characters that we know really well, around prequels that will impact the movies that have come in the past, and the music, and in a way the movies that will come in the future, in terms of the timing of the release, the troubled production that was so well publicized. All of that could play a very lukewarm critical response. All of that playing into how Solo panned out. However, what I do wonder is if they really still are sitting there with that approach in mind and figuring out what Star Wars is for them right now. Because if we think about it, that's very unclear. We have JJ's movie closing out this trilogy and supposedly closing out the story of the Skywalkers.
Right.
And then we have Rian Johnson on paper working on this other trilogy that's completely disconnected from the Skywalkers. We have David Benioff and D.B. Weiss working on a series. We have the streaming service. So there's so much in flux right now. Do you think that they're still sitting there going, okay, it didn't work with Solo because that production was just troubled and we just had to release the movie and it is what it is. We think it can work with Boba Fett. We think it can work with Obi-Wan. And they're doing a ton of market research around all of this right now.
Right.
Do you think they'll still try that?
It's tough to say because I think that they might be taking the Solo hit a little bit harder than we initially thought they would. I do think that one of their biggest challenges is China's such a huge market that doesn't want one of your biggest properties. If I'm in charge over at Disney, if I'm Iger, I'm like, you guys better figure out a way, to make China love Star Wars. I don't care if you've got to reinvent the wheel or if you've got to, make a whole new set of characters, whatever it is. So my hope would be that they, try maybe the Rian Johnson trilogy with new characters, something more along the lines of like a Star Wars Rebels where it's within that world, but it's a completely different characters. I think maybe that's a better angle than trying to get a market to fall in love with characters, like to catch up, essentially.
I think so too. And by the way, Rebels is great, and so
Rebels
is
is
Clone
so
Wars.
awesome.
It's
Yeah.
so awesome. I think so too. It'll be interesting to see what works. Like Fast and the Furious works in China.
Right.
Put them in really fast spaceships and have them
A whole pod racing movie.
or like an intergalactic, heist with a family that drinks Corona. These are the ideas. You're welcome that I am not working there and delivering them. There is a way to make it work and have that appeal, but you're right. It also has to work within the framework of discovering and unveiling and deciding what Star Wars is now, because here's the other thing in terms of the way they are approaching the films now. Star Wars, the sagas, outside of the expanded universe, outside of the cartoons that you and I both really love, it's a really specific thing, or it was, in terms of being about this family, the saga, this space opera adventure. It was an inherently political film, not in the way that you're thinking, but in terms of good and evil.
Right.
They were referencing Nazis. They were talking about rebellion against an empire. It was a very rare, special, specific thing, and now it's not.
Right.
Right? Now it is also Rogue One, and it's also Solo, and it's also whatever these other films in development are, and then also this live action series. So now what you've really got to decide is, what is it? And how do we move forward with a clear vision for what Star Wars is in the world today? And so we talked to Richard a little bit about Kathleen Kennedy and her approach. What's your take about Kathleen Kennedy?
I think Kathleen Kennedy is someone who, before Lucasfilm, she cast a very large shadow in Hollywood. She's been a huge producer in Hollywood since she was in her early 20s for 40 years now, and she's worked with these A-list directors all the way through. And so she is very much a part of the embedded Hollywood establishment that is neither particularly young or particularly hip or with it. And so far, she has given very traditional Star Wars movies, and like people that have gone and very. So they're not like the Marvel films, the way they've now been having these directors just take these stories in wildly different directions and everything. And so the question is she going to be able to open that up a bit? Because just doing the cookie cutter Star Wars movies by the numbers is going to start to get old at some point.
So here's one thing that I want to say before we really dive into Kathleen Kennedy and what's going on over there at Lucasfilm right now. I think, and Richard mentions the comparison to Marvel, I've made it a lot. It's a very natural comparison to make. It has the same parent company. It's right? It's Kevin Feige's role and Kathleen Kennedy's role. It's very natural to want to compare those two things and how they're each approaching their individual franchises. However, here's the difference in my mind. They're just very different kinds of producers who have had vastly different careers. And my analogy is, I have this idea for a website, truly, I really do, that I've had for 7 years now. I've sat with it, I've thought about it, I've done research on it. I have a vision for how it could work. If somehow I'm given the cash support to start to explore that, and slowly but surely it starts to work, and then I build upon it, and I build upon it, and then build upon it, and this larger vision comes to fruition, that's one path. That's the Kevin Feige path. He had this idea, this really, on paper, crazy, out-of-the-box idea that you could have in movies the same kind of thing that you have in comics, in which characters meet up, come together for big adventures, then go off and split off into their own. Crazy! Bonkers, bananas, no one would have believed it, but slowly but surely, he started to make movies. Mostly they worked. There were some stumbles, and over time, oh my God, we have the MCU, unprecedented. Books will happen about this for sure. The other half of that is, I am hired to go take over one of the largest brands in the world that is currently on life support. It had poorly received prequels. It's doing nothing. It's just sitting there, and I got to bring it back to life somehow. Those are two very, very different paths. Those are two very, very different tasks. And whatever we're going to say in terms of what works and what didn't, in terms of how Lucasfilm has approached this, some things have worked, some things haven't. She brought that back to life. She absolutely did.
Yeah, taking on the Star Wars brand is just... It's a task I wouldn't want to put on anybody, because there's no way to win. And yeah, I do think that, when Kevin Feige was kicking it with Avi Arad over at Sony, he was already thinking of these bigger plans, but he didn't inherit Marvel after Infinity War, which is essentially what Kathleen Kennedy was doing with Star Wars. It had its grand heyday. It was its thing. At that point, I think, only the Clone Wars cartoon was really the only kind of thing that Star Wars was out in the pop culture at that point. When the prequels ended, a lot of most general fans' interest ended with Star Wars. So to bring it back, and not only to bring back Episode 7, but have Episode 7 become like one of the biggest movies ever. I think it's still number one domestically. That's a tough feat to do. She had a much different, in my opinion, harder job than Kevin Feige. That's not to diminish what Kevin Feige has done. It's very difficult to come into something that's established and try to get it going again and have it actually work. We've seen how many sequels 15, 20 years later that everyone, it's like excited about, and then they do nothing.
Yeah. And that said, of course, there are look, I've talked about this before. I understand where fans feel a piece of ownership over these things. And you wonder, what's this person doing with my baby? And you feel emotional about it, and you feel an emotional level of emotional investment, because I have that too, and I really do get it, and I get the criticisms and the desire to see this thing that you love go the way that you think it should go, and for you to get the kinds of movies you want to see and to feel really passionate about that. I actually do understand that desire, but to your point, we're backseat driving a thing that I would never want to drive. It's like being president. Yeah, sure. In a lofty theory, that sounds fun. In reality, that's horrible. Who wants that job? Way too much pressure. You go gray in a night. And she had the experience going in to do it. Look who she's worked with. Look what she's put on screen.
I mean, you love E.T., you love Jurassic Park, you love those, all those big blockbusters with George Lucas, Steven Spielberg. Like, she's been around for a long time. I think her approach to Star Wars was one of, how can I, pay service to what Star Wars already is, and that's why, some fans criticize Force Awakens for being kind of a rehash of A New Hope, but I think that was very deliberate. It's like, how can I prove that I can, make Star Wars what it is, and then maybe trying to feel out, doing some different things with Last Jedi, but then doing things that are too similar or too safe with Han Solo. I think it's very difficult. Like you said, Star Wars is going through an identity crisis right now, and we don't know what it is. And I think that's maybe been part of the stumbling block, is that we can't seem to all agree what we want out of Star Wars. And it's very tough to come up with a game plan for Star Wars movies and how to run this franchise when I don't know if we all know what we want anymore.
Yeah, and there are so many different moving parts and so many different people to satisfy. And in terms of, yes, the fan base, but Richard had given us some updates since Solo about the scuttlebutt at Disney in terms of Lucasfilm, which we'll be talking about in just a minute. But the fan base, this really impassioned fan base, which is important, but is also a relatively minor part of the total revenue stream for the people that are going to go to these movies, for the people that are going to buy the merchandise, go to the parks, things like that. You also have your corporate overlords to satisfy. You're trying to break into these other markets. It's a lot to juggle all at once. And one of the big discussions is, how does she actually interact behind the scenes with colleagues at Disney? And this is what Richard had to say.
I've heard that she is a very strong presence around there. That she has, like I say, she has lived at the top of the Hollywood food chain for 40 years. So having young upstarts come and question her or talk back, I've heard is not okay with her. Is not part of what she does. So it's you can see the benefit of that is you get a machine that puts things out and does, even if no one, even if people don't love every Star Wars film, it has relaunched a franchise that was dead, that was killed off by the Lucas prequels. I mean, this was completely just radioactive ground after that, and they have completely reignited that as a full-fledged growing industry worth lots and lots of billions every year. So that's a real accomplishment that a young wacky producer probably couldn't have pulled off in the same way. But how she will manage the series and let it grow, will she do that in the same way Kevin Feige has there at Marvel, is a real question.
I gotta say, I think you get to a place in life and a level of experience where you just don't suffer. You're like, I'm getting like a little get off my lawny, Like, I feel like what he's saying and what I've essentially heard before is that she just does not suffer sass. She just doesn't suffer fools. She doesn't suffer sass gladly. And on the one hand, like, that doesn't sound like a great collaborative work environment. On the other hand, you understand getting to that point and having a level of expertise in your field where, think about how she came up and who she came up with.
Right.
And there were, for her, and even for directors like Spielberg and the directors that she worked with, there were levels, right? There was an escalation in careers that kind of doesn't exist in the same way today. You wouldn't go from an independent film like American Graffiti, for example, to a multi-million-dollar, $100 million production, because that didn't exist. And it's also one of the reasons George Lucas had to self-finance Star Wars, right? Sure. It was just a different world then. You had to prove your merits over time, again and again and again. So when young directors come in after one or two films and sort of want to tell her how this is going to go, you can understand where the tensions are coming in. Also, my understanding is that behind the scenes on Solo, for example, which I wasn't a huge advocate of, frankly, a lot of the tensions were between Miller and Lord and Lawrence Kasdan.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, look, regardless of how you feel about Kathleen Kennedy and Star Wars, you do have to acknowledge that in terms of like women in film, I mean, she's one of the, founding mothers of women in film. She's delivered so many I mean, look at her IMDb is just a murderer's row of your favorite blockbusters. Like, you kind of have to go with her knowledge at this point. Her game plan, whether it was right or wrong, history will tell at some point. But I understand every decision that she has made so far with Star Wars. That doesn't mean I agree with every decision, but I understand it. When it comes to Lord and Miller, right, I've also heard that, a lot of it was with Kasdan, but Kathleen and Kennedy and Lawrence Kasdan, like, those are two people who are very well known in this industry. Lawrence Kasdan wrote Empire Strikes Back, which is many people's all-time favorite Star Wars movie. Yeah, I'm gonna go with my gut and be like, would I have loved to have seen the Lord and Miller Han Solo? Sure. Do I think it probably would have been not very successful like the one we got? Yep. At least the one that we got, I feel like tonally fits in with Star Wars, but again, if you think Star Wars has an identity crisis now, it sounds like that movie would have just gone a completely different direction. And I think Kathleen Kennedy's like, I gotta at least make this all feel cohesive somehow.
Yeah, and I think making an unfair comparison, again, I will, it's not unlike in certain ways in terms of when Feige was shaping Marvel, reportedly he was very, very, very hands-on in terms of like, there were some directors saying he would just pick the color scheme. I don't know how true that is or not. And he was not able to work with Edgar Wright, and they couldn't come to a cohesive decision about Ant-Man. And that may be because for Edgar Wright, who I love, and I would love to have seen that Ant-Man, he really was determined to have his version of that come to fruition, and it may not have matched the overall of what they were trying to accomplish with Marvel at that time, so it just wasn't a correct fit, so that didn't work out. Then we got Peyton Reed's Ant-Man, which frankly I like too. So it's a little bit different. Also, in terms of Marvel's Mrs. Thor: The Dark World,
right?
Alan Taylor did not work out for them. And there were times when they sort of took over control of movies from the directors when it wasn't working. Look, has there been in the quick history of Star Wars, that's happened now a number of times in terms of directors getting hired and fired.
I mean, Richard Marquand on Return of the Jedi basically ghost directed that movie, and George just did it all himself.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is not entirely new. And I'm with you. I remember I was actually on a set visit, a different set visit for Mortal Engines the day that it was announced that Miller and Lord were off Solo. And I felt very similar to what you just said. One half of me was wildly disappointed because I thought with their track record, they're the only ones that could have done something interesting with that.
Right.
But I understood the decisions in the sense that especially as they build this new Star Wars, it is Han Solo is sacred territory. And if the movie came off like it was making fun of him, I don't know that fans would have responded very well to that either.
Yeah.
know?
Solo was kind of the no-win scenario for them,
Yeah.
to borrow a Star Trek. It was the Kobayashi Maru of choices that you could have made to make a new Star Wars movie about. That's why, my takeaway from all this was I understand why she made the choices she did. I don't know why it necessarily had to be so public with Lord Miller, but it's also just kind of a statement. Like, Kathleen Kennedy, she knows what she wants, she knows what she's going to do, and she's not going to... You want to make a scene? She'll make a scene at a public restaurant if she has to.
Yeah, and how that's actually going to play out with Disney is a question mark. Also, one of the questions that fans have is, on the one side, like, I think there's a portion of the fandom that says, just right this ship, and everybody has an idea of what that means for them.
Right.
And for some of us who think, okay, well, if Star Wars really isn't about the sagas anymore, and it's not so specialized anymore, then yeah, probably at a certain point, it has to graduate to allowing filmmakers to have their own distinctive voices, the way Black Panther did, the way Thor Ragnarok did. Will she get there? Is a question we asked Richard.
There's nothing in Kathleen Kennedy's career that suggests that she is a wild risk taker. That she could still find that with her, and she could still find that in herself. It could still go there, but there's nothing about how she's operated or what she's done. And when you're looking at these films, the pressure of this film has to make $1 billion. If we don't make $1 billion, we're a failure, and all the ancillary revenues riding on that, like the pressure of that to just say like, oh, we'll take a chance of it. And it took, in fairness to her, it took Marvel a long time to get when Iron Man 3 is not or Iron Man 2 are not wacky upstart, let's just throw things at the fan here, and it took them a long time to gain the confidence to really try to be something different, and they're only 3 films in, so maybe they'll still find that.
So we spoke to Richard before Solo came out and sort of the chips fell where they did. So I did a quick update with him to say, what's going on at Disney? And he said, things. There are discussions. As we have stated, their dominance cannot be understated. However, there's upheaval there. There's a question mark about whether they're going to get Fox now. Is Comcast actually going to sweep in and take it away from them? There's obviously a lot of upheaval with Lasseter's exit from Pixar. And he was really hands-on creatively at Pixar. So what that is going forward is a big question mark for them. What Marvel is, even after Avengers 4, may be a question mark for them. It's great right now, obviously, but where is it going in the future? So for Lucasfilm to be in a state of upheaval the way that it is very discomforting. What he said was, they feel like they can't maybe even just not financially afford, but from public perception, afford a flop in a Star Wars. They cannot afford a Star Wars that is a flop, and it is. It's very likely not even going to make its money back. In addition to that, as we've been talking about, if Solo had come out and made $1 billion, this discussion wouldn't be happening about the vision of Star Wars and their concern that, is there a vision and what is the vision, and the upheaval around directors being in and out. But because Solo was a flop, that is a concern for them, and there may be a change in leadership there. And also, Kathleen Kennedy has now been doing this for a decade almost. She's been working on this.
Yeah, I'm sure this deal has been, even before it came to us, I'm sure there were preliminary talks and everything, but anyone taking on Star Wars for 5 years, that's 4 years and 364 days longer than I think I could do it.
Yeah, exactly. So the point is, she's been working on this. She may be getting to the point of kind of having her own fatigue with it. He said nothing would likely happen in terms of a shift in leadership before the fall. I have to imagine if you're Disney, and just on a PR standpoint, you don't want a big shake-up like that right now, so soon after Lasseter and Pixar publicly. Their shares did drop
Right.
After Solo's box office was so low. At the same time, they own ABC, and there was the Roseanne debacle. The pundits that I heard think it was really more about Solo. So they are concerned, and there may be some changes. She really may, he said, just be sick of it at this point. But I have to imagine they want to bring home this final film in the trilogy and then announce a change, even if it's sort of happening behind the scenes.
Right.
I will say, as a Star Wars fan and as a fan of cinema, and it's no disrespect to what they've done, because, and he said this too, like, no one's discounting bringing that thing back to life with The Force Awakens so successfully. No one is discounting that at all. But having a vision forward is really needed.
Right. Yeah, I do think someone like a Dave Filoni, who, the showrunner of Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels, a lot of Star Wars fans think, he could take it on and be very good at that. I don't know. I think story-wise, absolutely, but I don't know about the actual, the producing part of it.
And here's my thing with that. I love Dave Filoni. So I understand why there's that big call for Dave Filoni. I get it. I truly do, from the fandom. And again, this is no disrespect. I really think... let's just all try to be loving to one another and not disrespectful, because I really respect her as somebody that came up in this industry. Could not have been easy at all, and has delivered some of our favorite films and been a part of some of our favorite films of all time. That said, I get the desire for Dave Filoni, but to me, I liken Dave Filoni to Jeff Johns. That if you put him in that position, it would be as big of a mismatch as it was for Jeff Johns to have to be an executive.
Right.
And DC moved him away from being an executive, so he could focus on what he's awesome at, which is telling stories.
Right.
Feige is this weird hybrid human who is somehow able to be both very creative and an executive at the same time. But he's not sitting there writing the stories,
Sure.
He's a true creative producer that comes around like once in a generation. Kennedy's a producer, right? So if you have Dave Filoni in a high up position in terms of the storytelling, you probably still need someone to be that head executive.
Right.
I don't know who that person is. Your guess is as good as mine. But again, that's my take on Dave Filoni, that he's more like Jeff Johns.
Yeah, I do think you need, we keep saying, like, what is Star Wars now? Because it's different. For us, it was those original 3 movies. And then for a whole nother generation, it was prequels. And, now, I saw kids on Halloween this year dressed up as Ezra and Hera from Star Wars Rebels. So I feel like Star Wars evolves. And we just need to, and I feel like maybe part of the problem is, Star Wars, the brand has evolved. Star Wars, the films are in a state of arrested development, and we don't really know what does everybody want. So I feel like someone needs to come along with a game plan like a Kevin Feige. And we also have to understand that not every Marvel movie from Iron Man to Infinity War was great. There were mistakes. There are some ones where we had to learn, Iron Man 2 and Thor 2. We had to work out some kinks. So I do feel Star Wars needs to be able to make a few mistakes or have some growing pains. But I think rebooting and prequelizing every character might not be it. I think, moving away from that, someone who has a game plan of like, let's take what we love about Star Wars and make it for a new generation. And I hate to say it, I kind of feel like some of us old timers who are like, no, my Star Wars, like, you're right. It's not your Star Wars. That's how it's going to survive, is to evolve it, have a new generation come in and love it for what it is to them.
Yeah.
And someone who can balance that, both creatively and financially, because that is tough. That is tough to kind of distance yourself from the Han, Luke, and Leia, because that's been the moneymaker for 30, 40 years now,
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how it shakes out. But what I like about that, and something that I think that we can all think about, just asterisk, maybe Dave Filoni would be a great executive. I don't know. He's certainly been an executive.
I like your idea, though, that he probably is best spent writing a new trilogy or new scripts.
Yeah, and not being in like 52
worrying about budget
meetings. You know what I mean? Like, oh God. But he should certainly be a big part of it. That would be fantastic. Creatively. I think what's cool about what you're saying is essentially like, and maybe this is the way that we can think about this, Because look, when Solo came out, I really felt that it was not what I wanted in terms of how I felt about Star Wars.
Right.
It did not match my fandom, but it matches someone else's, and that's okay because the overriding thing that we have in common is Star Wars. Maybe you love the prequels; those aren't mine. Mine are the originals, and I also love the cartoons. Maybe we intersect in some parts of what Star Wars is and then diverge in other parts, but there is something for everyone. And if it can become that, and if we as a fan base can think of it that way, that you and I can have very different opinions about one of the movies, which we do. We have very different opinions about two.
Yeah.
And still be fine with that and be fine with what Star Wars is in total and trust that it's actually kind of cool that there's something for you and something for me and something for all of us in it, then won't we just have a better world?
It's what's made something like Batman such an enduring character. You can have campy, fun, silly 60s Adam West Batman. You can have
my Michael Keaton.
Right. You can have a very dark Christian Bale or Ben Affleck. Like, there's Batmans for everything. And yeah, I don't like all of them, but I love Batman. You probably don't like all of them, but we diverge in certain places and intersect in others, and that's why Batman has lasted as long as he has. And I think that's the key to making Star Wars last is to appeal to the different fandoms, and I feel like that ultimately it does a pretty good job of that.
Yeah, and I guess one final thought on that is like I do think that potentially there is maybe something to be said for some of these films and some of these endeavors having a budgetary cap.
Right.
Because the estimation might be, like with Deadpool versus another X-Men franchise film, you may just, although Deadpool killed it, right? So they defied this. But if you have a budgetary cap, you can be more creative, you can take more risks. And two, maybe there are certain things that actually on paper don't seem very niche, like Solo, but are.
Right.
They're targeted very specifically, and so they're only going to make so much money back. So don't invest. Solo's a little different. They had to spend way above budget in order to almost completely reshoot it. Nobody intended that. But yeah, budgetary caps are something to think about. But the bigger picture thing to think about is the idea of Star Wars, not just Star Wars, but everything. It's okay.
It's okay.
It's okay to have a different opinion. It's okay that there's something for you and something for me, and that we can still be friends. And there's some things that we share, right? And that's okay with Star Wars too. It's some of the bigger lessons, So let's all have Star Wars be for all of us, and very calmly on this beautiful weekend, discuss our feelings and thoughts in the comments below and be nice to each other.
Yeah, may the Force be with all of you, no matter what you like or don't like.
May the Force be with you and also with you. Happy weekend, and we will be back on Monday.